The night my husband took my chair away, I was 9 months pregnant, swollen with his child, fighting back contractions, and standing in a silk dress that no longer fit over my stomach while his mother smiled like I was the embarrassment instead of the wife. The hostess had just reached for the last empty seat at the table when Adrian put his hand on the back of it and said, loud enough for everyone in the private dining room to hear, "Not that one. Vanessa needs to sit close to me. Lena can stand for a little while. It's not like dinner lasts forever." Everybody laughed, not the kind of laughter that comes from joy. It was the thinner kind, the crueler kind. The kind people use when they want to pretend humiliation is a joke, so they don't have to admit they're participating in it. His mother lifted her wine glass and looked me up and down, lingering on my stomach like even my pregnancy offended her. "Honestly, Elena, you should have stayed home if you were going to make everything so physically difficult. We planned this dinner for important business." Important business. Those two words hung in the air while the baby pressed hard beneath my ribs and a sharp band of pain pulled through my lower back. I remember the scent of rosemary butter from the bread service, the low amber lights reflecting off crystal, the polished black wall behind the bar with the gold emblem of the restaurant glimmering above it. I remember Vanessa smoothing her dress and slipping into the chair that should have been mine, crossing her legs like she belonged there, then offering me one of those soft, sympathetic smiles women use when they know exactly what they're doing. And I remember something else too. The way the entire room went silent when the general manager saw me standing percusi. He knew whose restaurant it was. He knew whose name was on the ownership documents, whose signature approved every executive hire, every menu expansion, every flagship opening, every renovation, every lease, every acquisition, mine. But in that moment, no one at Adrian's table knew that yet. So I stood there with one hand on but the curve of my stomach and looked at the family I had spent the last year trying to love, trying to impress, trying to survive. And for the first time in months, I stopped feeling ashamed. I started feeling angry. Not the loud kind, not the reckless kind. The kind that gets very quiet just before it changes everything. Adrian mistook my silence for weakness. He always did when an audience was present. He leaned back in his chair, loosened his expensive tie, and gave me that look I had once mistaken for confidence, but now recognized for what it really was. Entitlement sharpened by habit. "Don't be dramatic," he said under his breath, though not so quietly that his sister couldn't hear. "You're embarrassing yourself." His sister Sienna snorted into her champagne, and all of us, his mother Diane, pressed a folded napkin against her lips as if I were making the room unpleasant simply by remaining in it. "Really, dear, there's a stool near the service station if you need to sit down." A stool, 9 months pregnant, at a family dinner, while my husband seated another woman beside him. And what made it almost beautiful, in a dark and bitter way, was that they had chosen to humiliate me in the one place in this city where they had the least power. They just didn't know it yet. If you had met me 3 years earlier, you never would have believed I would end up standing in a private dining room fighting tears while a room full of wealthy people decided whether I was worth a chair. Back then, I was the woman who walked through kitchens before sunrise in sneakers and a wool coat, tasting sauces with line cooks and checking flour deliveries with hostesses and memorizing the names of dishwashers' children. I was the woman who could read a profit sheet before coffee and still spend an hour debating the shape of a bread plate if I thought it affected a guest experience. I was the woman my grandmother had raised to believe that hospitality was not about luxury, it was about dignity. It was about making sure no one who entered your space felt invisible. My grandmother, Rosemary Vale, built the first alder and oak restaurant with a bank loan she had no business getting, and a vision no one around. Her thought was practical. She started with one narrow storefront, 6 tables, and a menu written in pencil. By the time she died, Alder and Oak had grown into a chain of 28 restaurants across 5 states, known for warm service, fiercely loyal staff, and the kind of food people drove hours to eat on birthdays, anniversaries, and nights when they needed reminding that life could still surprise them. Most people knew Rosemary Vale. Very few knew me. That was by design. After my parents were gone and my grandmother's health started failing, she transferred majority control of the company into a private trust and put me through every possible test before she let me touch it. She made me work hostess shifts. She made me clean walk-ins. She made me sit with accountants until midnight and learn why good restaurants died. She said the family name was worthless if I expected it to carry me. The business would only survive if I understood every seat in every room, from the owner's chair to the employee meal in the back alley. So I learned quietly. I learned under my mother's surname, Hart, which I had kept since childhood. I learned how to move through my own restaurants without fanfare. I learned that wealth kept private was often safer than wealth performed. After my grandmother died, I took formal ownership, but I rarely used my title outside board meetings. Publicly, our CEO handled press. Legally, the trust protected my privacy. Internally, everyone important knew me. Externally, I was just Alina Hart, a creative consultant in hospitality. It suited me, it protected the company, it protected me, and though I did not know it then, it would eventually expose the man I married. I met Adrian Whitmore on a rainy Thursday evening in our Boston location, though he had no idea it was ours. He came in late, expensive coat, perfect hair, that kind of polished charm that makes everyone in the room look twice before they realize he's already decided they should. He wasn't there for romance. He was there because his firm was pitching a financing package to a neighboring property owner, and the meeting ran long. He sat alone at the bar, ordered whiskey, sent back the first dish because it was too rustic, then tipped the bartender $200 for no reason. All I noticed him because he didn't fit. He noticed me because I laughed when he asked if I worked there, and I said, sometimes. He asked what that meant. I said, it means I'm either very underqualified or very overqualified, depending on who's asking. That made him smile. A real smile, not the practiced one he used later in boardrooms and photographs. He stayed an hour longer than he needed to. We talked about food, travel, music, family. He told me he came from old money but wanted to build something of his own. He said he hated performative people. He said he wanted a life that felt real. I wish I could go back and ask myself why that line mattered so much to me. Maybe because I had spent so long being careful with the truth about myself that the idea of someone wanting me without the armor of status felt like freedom. Maybe because grief leaves strange openings in people, and I still missed my grandmother every day. Maybe because he looked at me like I was not a surname, not a trust, not an inheritance, but a woman. For the first year, I believed that was enough. We dated quietly. He took me to small places more often than grand ones. He kissed my forehead when he thought I was asleep. He listened when I talked about service, culture, and guest psychology and menu emotion. Even if he teased me for calling food emotional, he said he admired how grounded I was, how refreshingly normal. Normal, I should have heard the insult inside the compliment. Asterisk. He introduced me to his family 6 months in, and that was the first time I felt the temperature change. Diane Whitmore wore pearls to lunch and the expression of a woman perpetually disappointed by what life insisted on putting in front of her. She asked where my family was from, what my father did, what schools I attended, whether I had any proper social affiliations, and when I answered plainly, she smiled in that bloodless way and said, how independent. Sienna was worse. Younger than Adrian by 3 years, professionally unemployed, permanently online, the kind of woman who treated cruelty as wit if enough people were watching. She inspected my dress, my shoes, my accent, my hands. You have worker hands, she said once, turning my wrist over like I was an object at auction. That's actually kind of charming. Richard Whitmore, Adrian's father, was the easiest to miss. He had the posture of a man who had outsourced his convictions years ago. He drank too much, spoke too little, and let Diane decide which version of him entered a room. Adrian apologized for them after every dinner. That's just how they are. They'll warm up. My mother tests everyone. Don't let Sienna get under your skin. And because I loved him, and because women are trained from girlhood to confuse endurance with virtue, I believed patience would fix what character had already revealed. When Adrian proposed, he did it at a quiet inn in Vermont in the middle of winter. Snow on the windows. Fire going low. No photographers, no audience, just a ring in his palm and tears in his eyes, and that same voice from the early days telling me he had never felt more himself than when he was with me. I said yes. I did not tell him that I owned alder and oak. I told myself it was because I wanted one thing in my life, untouched by calculation. I told myself it was because wealth changes people's posture faster than love reveals it. I told myself there would be a right time. After the wedding, perhaps. After the first year. After I felt certain that what he loved could survive the truth of what I possessed. He knew I worked in hospitality consulting. He knew I had family money, though I let him assume it was comfortable rather than extraordinary. I paid for things without drama. I owned an apartment before we married. I signed a prenup at his family's insistence without complaint because I had lawyers revise it into something ironclad. Adrian barely read the final version. Diane's attorney assumed I was sentimental and unsophisticated. My attorney, Thomas Reed, had known my grandmother for 30 years. There are many ways people betray you. Sometimes they lie to your face. Sometimes they underestimate you so deeply it becomes its own kind of confession. For a while, marriage was manageable, not perfect, never that, but manageable lot. We moved into Adrian's townhouse in Back Bay because he said my apartment was too small for the kind of life we'll build. I let him choose the furniture. I let his mother talk me into a wedding that doubled as a social performance for people I would never see again. I let Sienna mock the simplicity of my family heirloom earrings because I didn't want every gathering to become a battleground. I believed compromise was what wives did. I believed love could soften class obsession. I believed Adrian when he said we were a team, even when teams started sounding suspiciously like follow my lead. Then I got pregnant. For one shining week. He was ecstatic. He lifted me off the kitchen floor and spun me around when I showed him. The Tessie cried into my neck. He bought books. He kissed my stomach before there was anything to kiss. He told everyone we knew that fatherhood would be the making of him, and maybe some part of him believed it. But pregnancy did not make Adrian better. It made him reveal himself faster. The first change was subtle. He started referring to my life as something transitional. You won't want to keep working like this once the baby comes. We should simplify your finances. My father knows a great wealth manager who can consolidate everything. There's no reason for you to keep your own separate systems when I handle far more complex investments. I smiled and deflected because I had heard versions of that language before from bankers, suitors, consultants, men who thought competence belonged more naturally in their hands. Adrian was not entitled to my holdings, and thanks to the revised prenup he would never be, but I wanted to see how far he would go if I did nothing to stop him. It turns out the answer was farther than I could have imagined. By the 4th month, his firm had started bleeding money. Whitmore Strategic Capital sounded impressive on embossed stationery, but beneath the name was a badly managed portfolio and a family addicted to appearance. Richard had backed to vanity developments that collapsed. Sienna's branding venture burned cash by the hour. Diane spent like the family fortune refreshed itself by magic. Adrian, desperate to prove he was the competent one, became obsessed with landing a deal big enough to restore the Whitmore name. That was when he started circling Older and Okadod first. I thought it was coincidence. Hospitality groups were consolidating everywhere. We had expansion value, stable margins, loyal clientele, strong urban leases. We were attractive to investors. Adrian came home talking about a restaurant chain with untapped luxury potential and terrible sentimental management. He said the anonymous ownership group was old-fashioned, emotionally attached, ripe for restructuring. I stood at the kitchen island slicing peaches while he said all this, one hand resting on the small swell of my stomach, and felt something cold move through me. Do you know them? I asked. No one really knows them. He said, that's the problem. They operate through a trust and some invisible board. They leave money on the table because they're allergic to scale. But if we can get controlling interest, I can turn it around in 18 months. Turn it around. A company my grandmother built. A company I spent my adulthood protecting. A company whose staff he would have gutted if it improved a spreadsheet. I asked what chain it was. He said Alder and Oak. Then he took a phone call and walked away before he could see my face. That night, after he fell asleep, I called Miriam Chun, our CEO, from the bathroom floor. Miriam had been with Alder and Oak longer than Adrian had been shaving. My grandmother hired her fresh out of business school, and she grew into the one executive I trusted with everything. Efficient, loyal, impossible to intimidate. If Rosemary Vale built the heart of the company, Miriam built the spine. When she answered, she didn't say hello. She said, what did he say? Because she already knew. He wants controlling interest, I whispered. He's not getting it. No, I said, he isn't. There was a pause on the line. Then Miriam's voice softened. Elena, you need to tell him. I know, but I didn't. Not yet. That is the part people judge hardest when they hear this story. They ask why I stayed quiet, why I kept waiting, why I kept giving chances to people who had already chosen who they were. The answer is not flattering. It is not strategic. It is simply human. I loved a version of Adrian I met first, and grief does dangerous things to hope. It makes you loyal to potential long after reality has presented its evidence. Also, I was pregnant, and pregnancy, at least for me, was not glow and grace and folded baby clothes in warm sunlight. It was nausea that left me trembling over sinks. It was low blood pressure, severe swelling, and a scare at 26 weeks when I ended up in triage after working too long. It was my doctor Priya Shah looking me straight in the eyes and telling me stress was no longer just my problem. Your body is asking for gentleness, she said, and if the people around you won't provide that, you'll need to provide it for yourself. I nodded doubt. Then I went home to a man who barely looked up from his laptop when I told him I needed reduced stress. What does that even mean? Adrian asked. Everyone says that to pregnant women now. Stress is life. No, I said. Stress is what's happening to me. He sighed like I was making logistics inconvenient. Okay. Then don't do anything stressful. As if stress were a meeting I had chosen to schedule. Diane grew more intrusive as my due date approached. She sent nursery designers I did not ask for. She criticized my doctor because Priya did not look old enough to know anything. She suggested a scheduled delivery that fit the family's charity gala calendar. She insisted the baby should have Whitmore as a first name if it was a boy and Diane as a middle name if it was a girl. She referred to the nursery in my own house as our nursery and once told a friend, in front of me, that she was relieved her grandchild would at least be raised with proper standards. When I pushed back, Adrian said I was taking things personally. When I cried, he called me hormonal. When I asked him to come to appointments, he came late or checked emails. When I told him I felt alone, he said, "You have no idea how much pressure I'm under, and then came the money. He never fully cut me off, because he thought I had more than enough savings to appear comfortable. But he began talking about shared discipline and smart optics and post-baby budgeting, in ways that felt less like partnership and more like containment. He suggested closing the joint account and consolidating expenses under his office manager because it would reduce clutter. He asked for access to documents I never showed him. He had his attorney send over what he called a routine post-nup clarification and acted offended when I refused to sign it without review. Thomas Reed looked over the draft and called me immediately. "Did your husband explain paragraph 14? "No. Paragraph 14 gives him disclosure rights to any previously undisclosed holdings that could materially affect marital lifestyle." I sat very still, and if I had signed, you would have opened a legal argument, not an automatic transfer, but an expensive, ugly, deeply opportunistic legal argument. I closed my eyes and thought about Adrian kissing my stomach and saying we were building a future. "Thank you, Thomas, Elena," he said carefully, "if you want my personal opinion, not my legal one. I think your husband's family is hunting by the 7th month." The mask had slipped so badly even strangers could see the outline underneath. At one of Sienna's rooftop parties. I was tired and overheated and leaning against the terrace railing when 2 of Adrian's colleagues started talking near the bar. They did not realize I was within earshot. "She's sweet," one of them said, nodding toward me. "But this marriage came at the perfect time." "For him, you mean," the other answered. "Diane's been trying to get him attached to money for years." They laughed. I went home and threw up until my throat burned. When Adrian came into the bathroom, annoyed because we had left early, I asked him directly, "Did you marry me because your family thought I had money?" He stared at me like I had insulted him. What kind of question is that? The kind that deserves an answer. He crouched in front of me, took my face in his hands, and said all the right words with all the wrong energy. "I married you because you were different. Because you weren't like the women in my world. Because you made me feel sane. It should have comforted me. Instead, I heard what he didn't say. Not once did he say because I loved you. Still, I stayed. I told myself I would make a decision after the baby came. I told myself maybe fatherhood would either refine him or expose him so fully I could finally stop bargaining with illusion. I scaled back my company involvement, officially citing medical leave. Miriam handled operations. Thomas tightened every protection around the trust. Priya monitored my blood pressure, and Adrian grew more distant, more irritable, more consumed by the Alder and Oak acquisition. He started bringing Vanessa around more often. Vanessa Cole was sleek, polished, and young in a way that knew exactly how powerful it was. She worked in corporate communications for Whitmore Strategic Capital. Though the line between employee and accessory blurred whenever Adrian entered a room. She laughed too quickly at his jokes. He touched his arm to his. She spoke to me with tender little daggers wrapped in concern. "You must be exhausted," she said one afternoon in our kitchen while Adrian searched for a file in his office. Honestly, I don't know how women do the final month. I'd probably just hide. I looked at her over a glass of water. That would require wanting to disappear. She smiled as if she hadn't heard me. A week later, I found one of her earrings in Adrian's car. He said she had borrowed the vehicle after a client dinner. I asked why the earring was under the passenger seat instead of in the back. He looked at me for a long moment, then laughed. Do you hear yourself? You're 9 months pregnant and spiraling over jewelry. I should have thrown him out then. Instead, I memorized his face. Because something in me was changing, not breaking. Changing. The dinner happened 4 days before my due date. Diane called personally, which should have warned me. She never called unless an audience or agenda was involved. Her voice was lacquered with false warmth. We're having a private family dinner at the Commonwealth location on Friday. Just immediate family and a few business guests. It would mean a great deal to Adrian if you came. He's on the verge of something important. I almost said no. My ankles were swollen. My back hurt constantly. Priya had told me to rest. But Adrian stood in the doorway while Diane spoke, watching me with that unreadable expression he wore when he needed something and had not yet decided whether charm or guilt would get it faster. So I said yes. He kissed my temple after I hung up. Thank you. I know things have been tense. This can be a reset. I let myself believe him for half an hour. On Friday afternoon, Miriam called me from New York. I need to warn you, she said. Whitmore requested final attendance. Confirmation for a dinner at our Commonwealth flagship. They told the events team they're hosting select family ahead of tomorrow's acquisition discussion. Tomorrow's what? The discussion they think we're still entertaining. My body went cold. We never approved tomorrow. We didn't. Tom had pushed it. We were waiting for your decision. I sank onto the edge of the bed. Do they know? No, Miriam said. But I think Adrian believes the ownership side is sending a representative. He's been courting the board through intermediaries for weeks. Aggressively, I looked at the dress I had laid across the bed. Deep green silk, maternity tailored. One of the few things that still made me feel like myself. Don't cancel the dinner, I said. There was a beat of silence. Then Miriam, who knew me too well, asked, Are you sure?
Yes.
Lina, no, let them host it. Because suddenly I understood. Adrian had not invited me to dinner to reconcile. He had invited me to witness his triumph. Maybe to soften me, maybe to remind me where power sat in his family. Maybe to prove that no matter how pregnant, how tired, how close to motherhood, I was still expected to know my place. And if that was what he wanted, then I was done protecting him. From the truth, I dressed slowly. The baby was low that day, heavy and insistent. My stomach hardening every so often in a way Priya had said could be early labor or could be stress. I curled my hair, then pinned it back when the weight annoyed me. I put on my grandmother's gold bracelet, the one thing from her I wore when I needed courage. Adrian watched from the doorway while I fastened it. That's a beautiful piece, he said. It was my grandmother's. Maybe don't wear anything too sentimental tonight, he said casually. It's a business dinner. Something in the sentence made me smile. You notice what? Nothing. A Commonwealth location of alder and oak sat on a corner of downtown like a promise. Limestone facade. Tall windows. Gold-lit interior. Warmth visible from the street. This was the first flagship I oversaw after my grandmother died. I chose the music program, the leather on the banquette, the ratio of candlelight to table spacing. I approved the bread service and the tile in the powder room and the exact green of the velvet host stand. I believed then that rooms held memory, if you've built them honestly enough. As Adrian's driver pulled up under the awning, the doorman opened my door and saw me. His eyes widened for half a second. Then he lowered his voice and said, Good evening, Miss Hart. Not Ms. Whitmore. Miss Hart. Adrian barely noticed on time. The hostess greeted us with careful professionalism. She, too, recognized me. Her posture sharpened. Her smile flickered. Her gaze moved once toward the floor manager, who immediately disappeared, toward the back. Adrian placed a guiding hand at my waist like a performance for invisible cameras. Private room for Whitmore, he said. The hostess nodded. Of course, sir. I could feel the room noticing us. Not because Adrian was important. Men like Adrian always mistake glances for reverence. People were noticing because I had arrived, unannounced and visibly pregnant in a restaurant where I was rarely seen during medical leave. escorted by a man whose family had been courting an acquisition they were not going to enjoy. When we entered the private dining room, the table was already set. 10 place settings, 9 people seated, no card with my name. I looked once around the table and understood everything before anyone spoke. Diane sat at the center, draped in pale blue silk. Richard to her left, red-faced from Predner Scotch. Sienna beside him, filming the breadbasket for social media. Vanessa was already there on Adrian's right, wearing cream satin and the expression of a woman who had dressed for an outcome, not a meal. 2 of Adrian's business associates sat near the far end, along with a regional hospitality broker I recognized from past acquisition chatter. And the only empty chair was beside Adrian. Vanessa's purse rested on it. Diane smiled. Alina, you came. The baby shifted sharply beneath my ribs. I was invited, were you? Sienna murmured. Adrian took off his jacket and draped it over the back of his own chair. Vanessa, move your bag. But instead of handing me the seat, he said it with the careless impatience of a man rearranging accessories. Vanessa lifted her purse only halfway. Diane looked at the remaining empty place at the far end, then at the table, then at me. Oh, she said, I'm afraid we're 1 seat short. Nobody moved, nobody offered, nobody apologized. Adrian rubbed his forehead. For God's sake, it's one dinner, Lena, just take a stool for the first course. I stared at him. Maybe if he had whispered it, I would have left quietly. Maybe if he had looked ashamed, I would have spared him what came next. But he didn't. He said it like my exclusion was common sense. And then, as if the humiliation was not complete enough, Diane added, really, dear, in your condition, sitting so long at a formal table might not even be wise. Vanessa patted the chair beside Adrian. I'm only here because we have talking points for tomorrow. I feel terrible. No, she didn't. Not even a little. The first contraction that made me grip the edge of the chair hit then. Not a practice tightening. Not the mild pressure I had felt all week. A real one. Deep and wrapping and hot. I breathed through it while Diane kept talking about investor confidence and Sienna whispered something that made one of the associates laugh. When the pain eased, I straightened. The room watched me. Adrian, impatient now, nodded toward the wall. Lena. He used that tone. The way other people use fingers snapped at weights. It was the tone that assumed compliance had already been agreed upon, and something in me finally went still. I put my hand on my stomach and asked, very calmly, you want me to stand? His jaw tightened. Don't start. In front of your family at a dinner I was invited to. 9 months pregnant. Vanessa looked down at her menu. Sienna rolled her eyes. Diane exhaled as if I were vulgar. Adrian's voice turned cold. I want 1 evening without theatrics. The general manager entered the room then with the first wine service. Saw me, and almost dropped the bottle. He looked from me to the table to the missing chair and understood the shape of the insult in a single second. Is there a problem? He asked carefully. Before anyone else could speak, Diane answered. None at all. We are handling a minor family adjustment. The manager's eyes met mine. He knew better. He knew the rules of this room because I wrote half of them. No guest stands, if there is a chair available. No expectant mother is left unattended. No one is ever made to feel like a tolerated inconvenience. I could almost hear my grandmother in my ear. Hospitality is not what you serve, it is what you protect. And suddenly, standing there with my husband's mistress in my seat and his mother smirking over candlelight, I realized I had been protecting the wrong people for far too long. The manager opened his mouth to intervene, but I gave the smallest shake of my head. Not yet. So he stepped back. I stood through the first pour. I stood through Diane's monologue about legacy. I stood while Adrian outlined his brilliant vision for expanding Older and Oak into something less quaint and more globally competitive. He spoke about my company like he was describing a tired widow he planned to remarry for Lent. He had no idea. I had approved the red wine in his glass. No idea I had chosen the acoustic treatment in the walls. The olive oil on the table. The training. Language his server used. No idea the restaurant he planned to conquer had been carrying my grief, my labor, my family's memory for years. The contraction returned, stronger. I pressed my palm into the underside of my stomach and focused on breathing. The baby moved low, a dragging pressure that made sweat gather at the back of my neck. Then Adrian said something that changed the night. From cruel to unforgivable. He lifted his glass toward Vanessa and smiled. Frankly, I couldn't have gotten thus far without the right partner beside me. The room murmured approval. Vanessa's cheeks flushed. Diane beamed. and I felt the final, fragile thread inside me snap. Not because of the affair, though by then I was certain there was one. Not because of the public insult, though that would have been enough. But because he said it while our child was inside me, while I was standing. While every compromise I had ever made on behalf of that marriage lay bleeding on the floor between us, I took a slow breath. Then I reached into my clutch, pulled out my phone, and sent a single message to Miriam. Come in. Less than a minute later, the private room doors opened again. Miriam entered first in a charcoal suit, calm as weather. Thomas Reed came behind her, carrying a leather folio. With them was Julian Park, our board chair, and behind Julian, the general manager returned with two servers who were suddenly moving with absolute precision. Diane frowned. Adrian Hearth rose from his chair. I'm sorry, he said, already irritated. This room is private. Thomas looked at him without expression. Yes, it is. Miriam's gaze found me first. Not my stomach, not my face. Me, Elena, she said softly. We're ready whenever you are. The silence that followed had weight. Adrian looked from Miriam to Thomas to Julian, then to me. Confusion flickered, then annoyance, then something sharper as his mind raced to arrange facts into a shape that did not threaten him. Julian stepped forward and addressed the room in the polished, measured tone of a man used to making difficult things sound official. My apologies for the interruption. There appears to have been a misunderstanding regarding host authority in this space. Diane gave a brittle smile. And who exactly are you? Julian Parr, chair of the Alder and Oak Board. I watched Adrian go still. Diane's smile faltered. Vanessa looked at Adrian. Sienna lowered her phone for the first time all evening. Julian inclined his head toward me. And this, he said, is Elena Hardvale, majority owner of Alder and Oak Restaurants and principal trustee of Vale Hospitality. If the room had exploded, it could not have felt more abrupt. Richard nearly choked on his wine. Sienna whispered, what with all the vanity stripped out of it. Diane's hand froze around her glass. Vanessa's face lost color so fast it was almost fascinating. Adrian stared at me as if I had turned into someone else between courses. I did not move. I had been underestimated so long that the truth looked theatrical simply because it was finally visible. Thomas opened his folio. Mrs. Whitmore has maintained ownership privacy for security and governance reasons. However, given tonight's circumstances and Whitmore Strategic Capital's repeated attempts to solicit acquisition under materially misleading assumptions, formal clarification became necessary. Adrian stood. Elena, medium, corrected. He looked at her like he wanted to burn a hole through the air. You knew, of course I knew, she said. I work for her. The servers moved toward the table. One lifted Vanessa's purse from the chair beside Adrian. Another pulled a chair back from the table, carried it to the opposite end, and placed it not beside Adrian, not beside Diane, but at the head of the room where an additional setting appeared as if by magic. No, not magic. Preparation. Respect. Manager approached me and lowered his voice. Your seat, Ms. Vale. I looked at Adrian while I crossed the room. He had seen me tired, unpainted, sick, laughing, grieving, sleeping, forgiving. He had seen every softer version of me, but he had never seen me in possession of my full authority, and the shock of it hollowed him out from the inside. I said, Only then did I speak. You denied me a seat in my own restaurant. I said no one. Brett. Diane recovered first, because women like. Diane survived by turning shame outward before it can settle inward. This is absurd, she snapped. If this little charade is meant to embarrass my son, your son handled that himself. Mouth closed. Adrian stepped away from the table. Why didn't you tell me? There it was. Not an apology, not concern, not remorse for the way I had been treated. Why didn't you tell me? I folded my napkin into my lap and said, would it have changed? How you behaved tonight? His silence answered for him. Thomas continued, because men like Adrian only listen when consequences wear legal shoes. There's more. Whitmore Strategic Capital's preliminary proposal is formally rejected. In addition, our compliance review has identified irregular attempts to access confidential data through spousal disclosure channels and third-party pressure on junior staff. We are preserving all records. Adrian's face changed then. The insult mattered, the ownership mattered, but the threat to his deal that reached him in the bloodstream. That's ridiculous, he said. We pursued lawful acquisition. Miriam's expression did not shift. You pursued internal leverage through your marriage. Diane stood so abruptly her chair scraped the floor. How dare you? How dare I? Miriam asked.
Your
Family invited a 9 months pregnant woman to a private dinner. Removed her chair, seated your son's communications director beside him, and discussed seizing control of a company that belongs to her. I'd say we are well beyond dare. Vanessa rose halfway, then sat back down when no one looked at her. Sienna found her voice. This is insane. Adrian, say something. He was staring at me, and I could see calculation fighting with panic behind his eye. He wanted to understand how much I knew, how much power I had, how much damage could still be controlled. Another contraction ripped through me, sharper this time. I kept my face still, but Miriam noticed. So did Thomas. Elena, he said quietly. We can finish this later. No, I said. Because I had spent too many nights swallowing my truth to protect a man who would have watched me faint before offering me dignity. I was done postponing reality for his comfort. I looked around the table at every face that had measured me and found me lacking. Let me make this very clear, I said. Alder and Oak will never be sold to your family. Not now. Not later. Not later. Not through direct bid, proxy bid, or any subsidiary you try to hide behind. Effective immediately. All Whitmore-affiliated parties are removed from ongoing discussions with our brokers and barred from non-public access to company representatives. Diane laughed once, brittle and unbelieving. You think you can do that? Because you've inherited a few dining rooms, Julian answered before I could. She can do that because she owns the company. The words landed like a gavel. Adrian stepped toward me. Elena, you are upset. You're not. What? Let's not turn this into what? I asked. A moment you can't manage. He stopped. I could see it then, finally, all the way through him. Not just arrogance. Not just ambition. Or fear. Fear of losing status. Fear of being seen, without the myth of competence. Fear that the woman he had slowly diminished in private was, in fact, standing above him in the one language he valued most. Powered up, the baby shifted again, lower, harder. My back throbbed. Sweat gathered at my spine. Priya's warning rang in my head. I should have left then. I should have gone home, taken a bath, turned off my phone, let Miriam and Thomas deal with the rest. But fate, or karma, or whatever force, watches quiet women finally reach their limit. Had more in store, because just as I started to rise, Vanessa's phone lit up on the table. A message preview flashed across the screen before she could snatch it up. Still at dinner with your wife? One would have noticed if not for Sienna, who saw everything and filtered it only through Vanessa, she said slowly. Who's texting you like that? Vanessa grabbed the phone. Too late. Richard muttered a curse. Diane went white with fury, but not at Adrian. At exposure, I looked at Adrian. He didn't deny it. He didn't even have the decency to look ashamed that he just said. In that same tired tone he used whenever truth became inconvenient. This is not the time. And maybe that was the moment I truly stopped loving him. Not when he lied. Not when he condescended. Not when he hunted my company while sharing my bed. When he looked at me as wife. Carrying his child. Standing at the edge of labor in a room where he had publicly humiliated me and decided that his affair was, at worst, a timing issue. The contraction hit so hard I had to grip the table. Miriam was beside me instantly. We're leaving. I nodded, but before I could stand, warm liquid ran down my legs and onto the floor. The room froze. For one suspended second. Every cruelty, every secret, every performance stopped beneath the simplest, most primal fact in the world. My water had broken. Adrian moved then, finally, as if biology had accomplished what decency never could. Lena, don't touch me, I said. He stopped like he'd been struck. The manager was already calling for our on-site medical kit. Miriam had my bag. Thomas was clearing space. Julian was instructing staff. Diane stood near the table, with one hand over her mouth, not out of concern, but because even she could see the symmetry of disaster now. I rose carefully. My dress clung wetly to my legs. Pain radiated through my hips, in hot pulses. The baby was coming, as Miriam steadied me. I looked at Adrian one last time. When our daughter asked me one day why I left you, I said, my voice shaking now from pain and fury together, I want you to remember this room. Then I walked out of the restaurant I owned while my husband stood behind me with another woman's perfume on his suit. The car ride to St. Anne's felt unreal. City lights smearing past the window, my body tightening and releasing in waves. Miriam timing contractions with one hand and answering calls with the other. Priya meeting us at the hospital entrance because Miriam had reached her first. Thomas already sending instructions to security and legal contacts. The whole machine of my real life, the life I had stepped partly away from to play wife inside the Whitmore orbit, came alive around me like a structure remembering its foundation. Adrian called 13 times. I did not answer. He texted apologies, first, then confusion, then anger, then declarations that we needed to present a united front. Then, when none of that worked, messages that turned cold and threatening in ways I would later hand directly to my attorney. Don't make decisions tonight. You'll regret. We need to discuss what you concealed from me. If you shut me out of my child's birth over a misunderstanding, there will be consequences. Consequences. I was 6 centimeters dilated when I read that one and laughed so hard. Priya thought I might pass out. Labor is a merciful kind of violence in one sense. It strips the world down to what is immediate: breath, pressure, pain, endurance. Between contractions, things clarify. You stop performing. You stop cushioning other people. You stop pretending what hurts does not hurt. Around 3 in the morning, after hours of labor and blood pressure scares and the kind of exhaustion that makes your bones feel hollow, Miriam asked quietly if I wanted Adrian informed when delivery was closed. I turned my face toward the dark hospital window. I thought of his hand on that chair. I thought of Vanessa sitting beside him. I thought of Diane suggesting a stool. I thought of the messages, and I said, no. Miriam squeezed my hand once. No judgment, no lecture, just solidarity. At dawn, my daughter arrived screaming, furious, alive. The nurse laid her on my chest and the whole room disappeared. She was warm and damp and impossibly small for the size of the force she brought with her, dark hair plastered to her head, fierce little mouth. One hand open and closing against my skin like she was already reaching for the world on her own. Terms I cried so hard I could barely see her. Priya cried a little too, though she pretended not to. Miriam kissed my forehead and whispered, she's perfect. I named her Rose, after my grandmother, Rosemary Vale, after the woman who built tables where no one was meant to feel unwanted, after the woman whose bracelet was still on my wrist while I held the next generation of our family against my heart. 12 sacred hours. The world narrowed to my daughter's breathing. Then Adrian tried to enter the hospital room with Diane. Security stopped them because Thomas had anticipated exactly this. Adrian caused a scene in the hallway. He demanded access. He shouted that he was the father. Diane told staff the situation was being manipulated by unstable postpartum hormones. When that didn't work, Adrian sent flowers large enough to obstruct half the nurse's station and a handwritten note that said, we can fix this if you stop listening to people who want to come between us. People like Miriam, like Thomas, like Priya, people like the ones who had protected me. I tore the note in half without finishing it. By the second day, the story had started to spread. Nothing formal at first. Just whispers through the city's business circles. A failed family dinner. An exposed ownership structure. A scuttled acquisition. Adrian Whitmore publicly blindsided at an Alder and Oak flagship. In another family, shame might have inspired reflection. In the Whitmores, it inspired warfare. Sienna posted a vague story about liars hiding behind victimhood. A business gossip column ran an item implying I had concealed substantial assets from my husband and, weaponized late-stage pregnancy during a hospitality dispute. Then a more vicious rumor surfaced, that Adrian had privately questioned whether the baby was his. That was the moment. Thomas Reed transformed from trusted counsel into holy wrath in a navy suit. He visited me in the hospital with a stack of printed emails, draft statements, and a face I had only seen once before, when a landlord tried to evict one of our star families illegally. Before I proceed, he said, pulling up a chair, I need to ask whether you want a clean separation, or whether you would prefer truth. I looked down at Rose sleeping in the bassinet. What's the difference? A clean separation is private, controlled. We negotiate custody, assets, confidentiality, and move on. Truth is slower, uglier, but more complete. It involves exposing fraud, affairs, coercion, and, depending on what our forensic team confirms, criminal conduct. My body was still aching. My daughter was 2 days old. My marriage had collapsed in public. My heart felt flayed open. And still, when I thought of Adrian standing in that dining room calling me dramatic while I labored, the answer came as early truth. Thomas nodded once, as if he had expected nothing less. The first revelation was bad enough. Whitmore's strategic capital had not merely pursued Alder and Oak aggressively. Adrian had used his access to our home network, my calendar, and informal marital conversations to infer internal timelines, board vulnerabilities, and medical leave windows. He had leveraged the assumption that I was a peripheral spouse in hospitality, consulting, not ownership, to position himself as uniquely capable of pressuring a soft target. The second revelation was worse. Vanessa was not a flirtation. She was a full affair. Messages, hotel receipts, private car logs, deleted photos recovered by our investigator. It had begun in my second trimester, right around the time Adrian started pushing the postnuptial draft. The third revelation nearly hollowed me out. Diane knew. Not only knew about Vanessa, knew about me. Weeks before Adrian proposed, Diane had hired a private investigator to look into my background. The investigator traced my connection to Rosemary Vale and the Hartvale trust structure. It could not confirm asset control, only family ties and probable inheritance pathways. Diane told Adrian, "I came from quiet money." In one email she wrote, "Be patient. Girls like this don't flaunt wealth. Unless there's real wealth to protect." His reply came 2 hours later then, "I'll make sure she never has a reason to doubt me." I sat in the hospital bed with Rose in my arms and read that line until the letters blurred, not because it proved he had married me for money alone. Human motives are usually dirtier than that, more mixed, more self-forgiving. I think Adrian wanted me. I think he liked me. I think on some level he may even have convinced himself he loved me. But he also saw me as strategic, beneficial, useful, and once love mixes with opportunism, every tenderness becomes contaminated in retrospect. The final revelation turned grief into steel. Diana and Adrian had planned the dinner, not just invited me casually, planned it. A chain of messages recovered from Vanessa's company phone showed Diane insisting the seating arrangements send a clear signal before acquisition talks resumed. One message from Adrian, sent the morning of the dinner, read, "If she feels sidelined tonight, she may be more open to signing clarifications afterward." Just to stop the pressure. Clarifications. The postnuptial document Thomas had already flagged. Wanted me tired, embarrassed, isolated, close to labor, eager for peace. They wanted to corner me, and they did it at my own table. I did not cry when I learned that. Not then. I kissed my daughter's forehead and felt something in me settle with perfect calm. The Whitmores mistook softness for stupidity. That had always been their greatest error. By the time Rose and I were discharged, Thomas had filed for emergency separation, protective orders regarding harassment, and preservation motions across every relevant device and account. Adrian's firm, already unstable, began hemorrhaging clients. The rumor mill turned viciously on him because society forgives private cruelty more easily than public incompetence, and he had now achieved both. He tried every script available to a man losing control. First came remorse. He waited outside my apartment building in the rain one evening while Miriam's driver brought me home. He looked exhausted, stubble heavy on his face, tie loosened, bouquet in hand like he had learned apology from films. "Please," he said when I stepped onto the curb just 5 minutes. No, I was angry. I was stupid. My mother got in my head. No, I love our daughter. I almost kept walking. Then I turned back and asked, "Did you love her mother when you took away her chair?" He flinched. I left him standing there with the flowers drooping in the rain. When remorse failed, he tried blame. His attorney sent a letter claiming emotional deception, concealment of material assets, and paternal alienation. Thomas responded with 1 sentence and 4 exhibits. Nice try. When blame failed, Adrian tried access through sentiment, gifts for Rose, notes tucked into legal packets, audio messages in which he sounded fragile enough to move a less informed woman. "I don't recognize this anymore. I keep replaying the early days. Please don't let one terrible night erase everything." One terrible night. Men like Adrian always want to confine the damage to the moment that exposed them, never the years that produced it. I did not respond. Then came the paternity demand. It was not filed publicly at first, but the threat existed, and I knew exactly why. Not because he truly doubted Rose was his. He knew the timeline. He knew the truth. But paternity questions are social asset. They shift attention. They suggest scandal. They punish women by making our bodies seem evidentiary. Thomas said we could fight the demand, delay it, challenge motive. I said no, don't do it immediately. If Adrian wanted truth, he would drown in it. The test confirmed what we all knew, Rose was his. Tamas released the result only after Adrian's side leaked the allegation to a gossip site. The same day, Miriam's team quietly circulated documentation of Whitmore Strategic Capital's failed acquisition conduct to key industry contacts. We did not need to wage a tabloid war. We simply gave powerful people accurate information. Doors closed, invitations disappeared. 2 of Adrian's clients withdrew from pending engagements. A lender reviewed Whitmore debt exposure. Vanna resigned before she could be dismissed and then attempted to sell her story to an online outlet. But her credibility collapsed when internal messages surfaced showing she had mocked my pregnancy in group chats with Sienna. The city loves scandal. It loves downfall even more when downfall arrives dressed as justice. But none of that gave me peace. Peace came later. In smaller moments. Rose asleep against my chest. While dawn light moved across the nursery walls. My apartment filled with casseroles and flowers from Elder and Oak staff who had known me longer and better than the family I married into. Priya, dropping by with tea and scolding me for checking email. Miriam, sitting cross-legged on the nursery rug with a laptop, updating me on company matters while making ridiculous faces at my daughter until Rose gurgled for the first time. Love, I learned, was never scarce in my life. I had just spent too long offering it to people who treated it like leverage. 6 weeks after Rose was born, Alder and Oak held its annual leadership gala at the Commonwealth. Flagship. The same restaurant. The same private room. The invitation list was selective executives, regional directors, senior chefs, a handful of investors, legal counsel, and press. From 2 respected industry publications, because we were announcing a new employee equity initiative my grandmother had once dreamed of establishing. I had not planned to attend in person. Priya thought I should still be resting. But when I looked at the event mock-up and saw the room where Adrian took my chair, I understood that healing would require reclamation, so I went. Not in mourning, not in revenge, in ownership. I wore black silk with a high neckline and simple gold earrings. Rose stayed home with a nurse and my cousin Mara. My body was still healing, softer in places, stronger in others. But when I entered Commonwealth that evening, every staff member stood a little straighter, not out of fear, out of recognition. This was my house. The event went beautifully. Speeches, toasts, a short film honoring Rosemary Vale. Tears from half the kitchen team when they saw archival photos of the original storefront. When it was my turn to speak, I walked to the front of the room and looked out at the people who had built this company with me. I was taught, I said, that a restaurant is never just a business. It is a promise. A promise that people will walk through the door carrying whatever life has done to them that day. And for a little while, we will make room. Not because they are rich. Not because they are powerful. Because they are human, older. And Oak has survived because we have never forgotten that dignity is part of service. Tonight we recommit to that in how we treat our guests, our staff, and one another. The applause that followed felt less like performance and more like return. Then the doors opened. Adrian walked in. For 1 second. No one reacted. He looked thinner, harsher around the mouth, fury and desperation held together by an expensive suit. Behind him trailed Diane, still immaculate, still upright, still believing posture could substitute for innocence. Thomas had not invited them, which meant Adrian had come to force an ending of his own. He stepped into the room as conversation died. I need to speak to my wife. Every eye turned to me. Not my wife, I thought. Not anymore. Thomas moved first. You are not authorized to be here. Adrian ignored him. He looked only at me, and in that look was every version of himself he had worn over the past months. Wounded lover, abandoned father, wronged husband, furious son, Alina. He said, this has gone far enough. I almost smiled. No, I thought. It had finally gone exactly far enough. Diane stepped forward, voice ringing with patrician outrage. You have made a spectacle of this family. You have withheld a child, destroyed Adrian's reputation, and invited vultures to feast on private matters. Whatever grievance you had, it did not justify this level of vindictiveness. I set down my glass. Around us. The room held still. Staff, investors, executives, press. And then I understood why they had come. Not to apologize, not to reconcile, to intimidate me in public one last time. The old me might have flinched. The woman, who had labored alone after being denied a chair in her own restaurant, did not. I looked at Diane first. You arranged a dinner while I was full term. You removed my seat. You seated your son's mistress beside him. You planned to pressure me into signing away legal protections while I was physically vulnerable. And you're here to discuss vindictiveness. Face hardened. Adrian lifted his hands in exasperation. That's not what happened. Thomas said quietly, would you like the